Welcome to France 24 with me, Gavin Lee. It is 6 o'clock in the evening here in Paris, 1 o'clock in the afternoon in Caracas, midday in Washington, and we have an extended programme tonight, given the scale, the consequences of events in Latin America this weekend. More details are emerging of the capture of Nicolás Maduro in the early hours of yesterday morning. The extraordinary air, land and sea operation carried out by US military and special forces, the snatch and grab of the authoritarian leader and his wife from a safe house in the centre of Caracas, a move that has stunned US Congress, informed at the last minute, and other world leaders whose foreign intelligence agencies have barely had time to take in the actions and the consequences of what happened in the 2 hours and 20 minutes of Operation Absolute Resolve. It's been like watching a film, President Trump told reporters while he watched events play out live by drones and body cameras in Caracas, and the White House version of events posted on social media, not dissimilar to any Netflix trailer.
Venga por mí.
Last night, on the order of the President of the United States,
Aquí lo esperan Miraflores.
and in support of a request from the Department of Justice,
No se tarde en llegar.
the United States military conducted an apprehension mission in Caracas, Venezuela, to bring to justice two indicted persons, Nicolás and Cecilia Maduro.
¡Cobarde!
Nicolás Maduro had his chance until he didn't. He effed around and he found out.
This was one of the most stunning, effective, and powerful displays of American military might and competence in American history.
Like, I don't understand yet how they haven't figured this out. And now, if you don't know, now you know.
Now, the immediate focus is on, well, what happens next for Venezuela, given the legally questionable declarations from President Trump that Washington is now, quote, running the country until a, quote, safe, judicious transition, ensuring US access to its oil as well. The Venezuelan Supreme Court has named Vice President Dulce Rodriguez as interim leader. She's given a defiant speech against the US, but analysts suggest she may have secretly agreed a deal with the Trump administration. All the while, President Maduro, now in prison sandals and tracksuit, awaits trial and to appear in a New York court on Monday.
Good night. Happy New Year.
Good night, Happy New Year, he says. Well, joining our special programme tonight, we have a Washington correspondent in DC, Fraser Jackson, with us. And also coming up in the US, we have Gabriel Hetland, political sociologist specialising in Latin American politics, associate professor at the university and author of The Democracy on the Ground, Local Politics in Latin America's Left Turn. Here with me in Paris, Kethevane Gorjestani, our international affairs editor, and the French socialist senator too, Hélène Conway-Mouret. Good evening to all of you tonight. Great to have you with us on the programme. We begin in Caracas. The uncertainty there right now. Our reporter, Norris Ogote Soto, describing to us a short while ago what life is like the day after Maduro's rendition.
I've been watching closely, monitoring the international media, and I was watching how Venezuelans abroad have taken the streets to celebrate in their countries that they are in. But in Venezuela, the picture is widely different. There's not much people on the streets, and the ones that are on the streets are buying groceries, making lines to buy food, or just to fill their tanks with fuel. And also there's like an uneasy calm that you can even cut with a knife. Nobody's celebrating. Nobody is either rioting or protesting. Everything is silence. It looks like a kind of a mourning situation. But we think it's because people it's still very afraid as to the people who is in charge, was second in command with Maduro. So I think that's the reason nobody's celebrating or going out on the streets today, not even the police.
An update in the past few minutes. First of all, an announcement from the Venezuelan military saying that the population can now go about normal activities after the capture of Maduro yesterday. We're also hearing, this is from the Defence Minister Vladimir Pedrino in the past few minutes as well, saying, quote, a large part of Maduro's security team and, quote, according to the Venezuelan ministry, innocent civilians were killed in the raid. In the operation. Let's bring in Fraser Jackson in Washington. Very interesting coming from Venezuela. The information drip-fed through from the defence minister today. While the US Trump administration, on the front foot, it seems, Fraser, giving interviews, defending what they've done, justifying the reasons for doing it.
Yeah, Marco Rubio has been out on the Sunday shows today, giving a bit more kind of the US position and a bit more detail than Donald Trump went into his after his press conference. Marco Rubio very much defending what the US has done, but also kind of tempering what exactly we heard from the president. Donald Trump said that the US would be running Venezuela. It very much now appears that is not the case. That the Venezuelan government is still in position there, but the US is maintaining what Marco Rubio called a quarantine around Venezuela. So very much what we've seen over the course of the last couple of months, a significant US army and military presence in the region, blockading tankers, which Marco Rubio said was vital to the Venezuelan economy and funding the regime. So the US could potentially seize more of these oil tankers, these sanctioned tankers that we've seen over the course of the last few months. But very much the US prepared to do whatever it takes, in the words of Marco Rubio, to stop anything like the Maduro government taking root again, and anybody who has that kind of ideology. So Marco Rubio very much believes that the vice president, who is currently the interim president, is pretty much in line with the US and will do what the US wants. He says that he's going to monitor their deeds and actions over the course of the next few weeks and months and not take them at their statement value, because of course the Venezuelan government very much in its rhetoric is not standing with the US government and is very much the opposite of what Donald Trump said in his presser just yesterday. So for now the status quo kind of continues. We're still waiting to see what the full fallout of this is, but the US still maintaining that pressure on Venezuela and still reserving the right to send boots onto the ground if it wants to as well.
It's a very interesting point. We're going to hear from Marco Rubio in just a moment, the Secretary of State. Let's just take a look at live images now. I mentioned a moment ago the urging from the military for people to go about normal business. Take a look at this. This is in Caracas right now, people taking to the streets, ostensibly pro-Maduro supporters. It will be very surprising right now to see, given that the rump of the regime in place, and Dulce Rodriguez, the vice president, assuming the responsibilities of president, according to the Supreme Court there, those willing to decide to be defiant right now against the authoritarian government would be a much bigger risk. Let's hear then from Marco Rubio a short while ago explaining why the US didn't tell Congress, because he said there was no issue of legality. Let's take a listen.
We didn't occupy a country. This was an arrest operation. This was a law enforcement operation. He was arrested on the ground in Venezuela by FBI agents, read his rights, and removed from the country. The Department of War went in. They hit anything that was a threat to the agents that were going in to arrest him, and they hit anything that was a threat on the way out, and they hit anything that was a threat to them while they were on the ground. And that was a very limited and targeted operation.
Let's bring in Kethevane as well. Kethevane, very interesting. Fraser talked about this round of interviews. Marco Rubio also talking to CBS, and he's been asked about why the US is not supporting the opposition, Edmundo Gonzalez and Maria Corina Machado.
Yes, because that was something that many saw at possibly the logical step after removing Nicolás Maduro, and that's not at all what the Americans are doing right now. And what has been indicated by both Donald Trump and Marco Rubio is that they're, in a way, giving a chance to what is left of the Maduro regime, starting with, of course, the interim president now, Rodriguez, but also the rest of the apparatus, the rest of the government. And so the question was, put to Marco Rubio. You, a few months ago, called Edmundo Gonzalez, the man who stood in Machado's place to stand for those elections after she was barred, that the Americans believe won the election, and that Marco Rubio himself, at the start of the Trump 2 term, called the rightful president of Venezuela. And so he was asked, why did you not turn to these people to sort of start that transition that you're talking about? He sort of danced his way out of that question, saying that they had focused on getting rid of Nicolás Maduro and they could not, get rid of everybody at the same time. And then he was pushed again on why they would go for the rest of the Maduro regime, noting that Rodriguez herself is sanctioned by the Americans. The Interior Minister, Diosdado Casados Cabellos, he's also not only sanctioned, he is on that indictment that Nicolás Maduro is on as a narco trafficker himself. He has even a $25 million bounty on his head. He's the interior minister in charge of the police that is in part repressing some of the Venezuelan people. He's still around. The defense minister also has a bounty on his head from the Americans. All of those people are still in place and seemingly will be the people that the Americans are going to be negotiating with. And in this case, Marco Rubio again tried to dance his way out of it and said, look, you saw the military operation. There was no way that we could do this and remove 5 or 6 people at the same time. We focused on Nicolás Maduro. The reality is that if the Americans want to avoid sending tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of troops to control a country, they need to rely on the existing apparatus, the military, the police, the whole government system. And right now, the leader of that system, that apparatus, is Delcy Rodriguez, the interim president, and the people around her, including the interior and the defense minister.
Listening to you, Kethevane. Hélène is still with us. Hélène Conway-Mouret. Great to have you on the programme this evening with us, Hélène. I'd like to know, first of all, how are you viewing these events? What is foremost in your mind right now after what's happened in Venezuela and the consequences? And is it a curse or a blessing for Venezuela?
Well, it has taken us by surprise, as the Americans hadn't actually warned the Europeans about this military operation. Of course, nobody believed that the deployment of the US Navy in the Caribbean was simply to stop a couple of fishing boats carrying some bundles of drugs. So obviously there was a preparation of a major coup which has happened. So this every time there's kind of consideration as to what has actually happened. But I think it's very coherent with what Donald Trump is actually doing overall, both for the internal policies, to reassure the American people that is acting for them, and indeed fighting drug, which is a plague, is a just cause, except that violating the sovereignty of a state and kidnapping or capturing its president goes far beyond, what would be expected. So I think, it has sent a lot of messages. First of all, of the American military supremacy in the world, that indeed Americans can do what they want, where they want, when they want. Also, to us Europeans, to show us that indeed we do not count very much, but indeed that was announced with Mr. Vance's speech in Munich nearly a year ago, which we didn't want to, hear. That is that, in the world, there is China, there is Russia, and there is the United States, and everybody else is to go about, trying to find, its place between these big empires.
Very interesting couple of points that you made, particularly when it comes to the legality and Europe's response to it, because some of the, let's face it, Hélène, I think fair to say both from, well, not just President Macron, but also for Sir Keir Starmer in the UK and Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor in Germany, very cautious, very calibrated responses so far, saying we'll just check if it's in accordance with international law. Let me read this to you. This is Harold Hunching-Cole today, international law expert, a prominent legal advisor, formerly of the State Department in the US, said this: "It is false rationale to justify entering a country, capturing its president, and seizing its assets, its oil. This is, quote, naked profiteering, evoking a claim they are trying to suppress drugs. This is internationally illegal." What do you make of that?
Well, all of that is true. What this operation has done is to fracture, I think, for 2026 and after international security, because I do not see why tomorrow President Putin would feel that, he should act differently. Likewise with China and Taiwan. I mean, what will stop China tomorrow from taking over Taiwan, saying that it is in the interest of China, invoking whatever reason there may be. It's oil for the Americans. It could be the chips for the Chinese, and that's it. So it means that it's the rule of the strong ones that prevail, and it's the rule of force against international law. And of course, us Europeans, we may be the last continent to believe in democracy and democratic values, because if you see who has actually supported the American intervention, the American action, it's the extreme right. Leaders around the world, and certainly the 2 or 3 that are in power now in South America, who felt that what was done by the Americans was right. So, there's a very strong ideology. There is a kind of a new world order. This was announced, but I think, what was announced is not taking place in front of our eyes. It has taken less than a year for Donald Trump to put in place what he has announced. And it is ideologically driven. And of course, it is not in line with international law or democratic values the way we know them in Europe.
Gabriel, listening to Gabriel Hetland, political sociologist. Great to have you with us as well on the programme tonight. First of all, did you see this coming? A lot of analysts talking about there was obviously a build-up for 5 months, but not many beforehand were saying this is about to start. How did you see it?
I was very surprised by what happened yesterday and over the last 24 hours and more. I've been following very closely Trump's policy in Venezuela over the last several months, and it was clear that he was focused on Maduro. It was clear that it wasn't really a drug operation. It was a hope for, but it seemed like he wanted to use various forms of non-military pressure to try to push Maduro out. And so it was really, frankly, shocking to see this military operation take place yesterday. It's a clear violation of international law. It's a clear military engagement. It's a sort of regime change operation, although whether or not it's actually going to effectuate a full regime change is a question. But it's different than what Trump has sort of railed against. I mean, he's talked about avoiding forever wars. He's talked about avoiding regime change operations, and now he's clearly engaged in one. So it was very surprising.
Gabriel, stay with us. Just looking at this live images at the moment from Caracas, the protest building there. For those just joining us here on France 24, we heard from the Venezuelan military in the last hour or so saying that they were urging people to come to the streets, to go about normal life, was the quote. What we're seeing now is those in support of Nicolás Maduro. It would be surprising to see those against Nicolás Maduro, given that the vice president is now ostensibly in charge, according to the Supreme Court. Going back to the point, though, Fraser Jackson also with us. This is President Trump saying that he's running the country. And I'm wondering whether you've scratched below the surface here, because I guess the big conundrum for people is the difference between what's going on publicly, Fraser, between Dulce Rodriguez, the vice president, and in the background, privately, with the Trump administration. We know she had a long conversation with Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. What's your sense of what's going on behind the scenes?
Well, ultimately, I think there's kind of a couple of things going on. We heard from Donald Trump that there was that phone call between Marco Rubio and the now interim President Rodriguez. Of course, Donald Trump has a history of hyperbole, so I definitely assume there is some kind of contact between the two parts of the different governments. But the content of that phone call and how it went, clearly there is a difference of opinion on that, because Donald Trump says that the phone call went really well and that Rodriguez ostensibly agreed to do whatever the US wanted just in order to kind of stay in power, as it were. But of course, Rodriguez, in her speeches since, has railed against the US government. She said it's been a kind of infraction on sovereignty, and her rhetoric has been a lot more heated than would be suggested by a civil phone call between Marco Rubio and Rodriguez. So either there has been a gross misunderstanding of the contents of that call and how well it went, or one side of this is effectively lying. So whether that is Rodriguez and trying to save face for her own public, and of course that is very much in the kind of vein of nationalism that we've seen from Venezuela to kind of stand against the US and oppressive foreign powers. Maybe that is her kind of bluff that she's upholding, or Donald Trump is also, once again making things out to have gone better than they had done. So it's kind of difficult to read which side this falls down on. I think what's interesting and important to note, though, is that we should not be that surprised by this. 2 months ago, in November, the US released its national security strategy, and in that strategy, it talked about how the US was recentering its focus now into its own backyard, into the Americas. So we should see and expect more of this kind of action, more of this kind of pressure on other Latin American and Central American nations. And indeed, Marco Rubio was asked about that just today on Meet the Press. He was asked whether Cuba was next, and he said the Cuban government is a huge problem. And when he was then pressed again as to whether the Cuban government could be the next target of this kind of pressure from the United States, he said they are in a lot of trouble. Yes. So just, prepare yourselves for this. This is not something that it was a blip on the radar. The US is recentering its focus to the Americas. It is moving its influence away from Europe, away from Asia. And this is what is ultimately is the worry when I talk to, diplomats here in Washington, and I talk to people about the potential, invasion of Taiwan, for example. People are worried that the US is now starting to look closer to home and is taking its eye off the ball elsewhere. So that obviously means that now the pressure is going to increase on various countries around the Americas.
But that rhetoric, Gabrielle, listening to Fraser's point, when it comes to the national security strategy, when you look at the Western Hemisphere, the US looking after its own backyard, as per the Monroe Doctrine back in the 1830s, going back in history to see what perhaps a touch of what Trump wants to see now. It also, we've heard the threat to Gustavo Petro in Colombia saying you better watch your backside. Same we were looking at Mexico next. Also, we're looking at Cuba, as Fraser talked about. But it also allows for the fact that President Putin is going to watch this, isn't he, and think, well, Ukraine is our hemisphere, it's our backyard. The same with Taiwan for President Xi.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's clear threats to any leftist or progressive or nationalist president in Latin America. The U.S. is sending a clear message that if you don't do what we want, we might come for you. I think the way that this will play in Latin America could be complicated. If we think of the case of Brazil, Trump has gone after Lula in the last year and, threatened massive tariffs. He's supported Bolsonaro. That's actually helped Lula, the president of Brazil. It gave him a boost in popularity. So, the way it plays, there could be an anti-American, anti-imperialist backlash that supports some leftist leaders, supports nationalist leaders, but absolutely Trump and Rubio are trying to send a very clear message that if you're not friends with us, if you don't do what we say, we are going to come from you. And as you and other speakers have pointed out, this sets a very dangerous precedent for the world and for Latin America that any strong nation, any great power, any empire can do as it pleases, and weaker states, smaller countries just need to follow along. And if they don't do that, they will be, pushed to follow along by those more powerful states. So this is a very frightening new world order that we're entering into. It's not totally unprecedented, of course, for the U.S. to try to have its way in Latin America, but this is an agenda of sort of pure naked dominance that Trump is pushing that we haven't seen for a very, very long time in Latin America.
I want to look at that in more detail, particularly on Cuba, Gabrielle. I also want to look at how it's splitting the MAGA movement as well. I just want to bring up to date with the fact there's a lot of information coming in, given the scale, given the consequences of this. In fact, a joint statement in the past few minutes from Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Mexico, Uruguay, Spain as well, saying that they, quote, collectively reject any outside bid to control Venezuela. That statement just coming in. We're also hearing, as Fraser mentioned a short while ago, the administration behind Trump doing various interviews today. Let's take a listen to one of them, the Secretary for War, Pete Hegseth, talking to CBS a short while ago.
We spent decades and decades and purchased in blood and got nothing economically in return. And President Trump flips the script. He says through strategic action, we can ensure that we have access to additional wealth and resources, enabling a country to unleash that without having to spend American blood.
So that was Pete Hegseth. We're also hearing in Venezuela, remember this is just after the aftermath of this capture, the rendition of Nicolás Maduro in the early hours yesterday. This is also about the war of optics, information. We're seeing that even from watching Nicolás Maduro in his arrest and those moments in front of camera, putting his thumbs up, giving that positive optics that he is still the leader, even though he's deposed. I want to also hear from Vladimir Pedrino. He's the defense minister in Venezuela. He's been also talking to the press in the past short while.
We are grateful for the prompt response of almost all the governments of the world and the peoples of the world, because we saw popular demonstrations everywhere and legitimate governments, with a few exceptions, rejecting this gross intervention in Venezuelan sovereignty. Let the world take note, because this represents a serious threat to the global order.
Let's bring in Kethevane Gorjestani and Hélène as well. First of all, Kethevane, I mentioned the MAGA movement. This is not universally popular, and it's worth saying that Marjorie Taylor Greene, who's recently fallen out with President Trump, has really made a point of saying this is not the right way to do things.
No, and she put out a pretty long post on X yesterday after the news came out, saying in part that basically the justification of going after Nicolás Maduro because it was a fight against drugs simply didn't hold up to the facts, because initially we were told it was about fentanyl when Venezuela doesn't really produce fentanyl, and that if we were going after Nicolás Maduro for drugs, then we should go after other cartels in Mexico and other countries, and also adding the fact that Donald Trump had recently pardoned the former president of Honduras, who was convicted and was serving time in jail in the United States for drug trafficking. So she sort of exposed what she called the hypocrisy of the Trump administration. She also pinpointed to something that is even more important to some in the MAGA movement, which is the fact that this was exactly everything that Donald Trump campaigned against when he was running for this term in 2024, that he ran on this idea that the U.S. should not be the policeman of the world, that it was America first, that they were going to focus on making Americans' lives better, and that spending billions of dollars to go and bring democracy around the world or get involved in other countries was not the way to do it. And so she is one of the voices that is coming out against Donald Trump and this attempt to take control of a foreign country. She is obviously a minority. As you reminded our viewers, she has also had a falling out with Donald Trump, but she does represent a certain fringe of the MAGA movement that is ideologically very opposed to any form of intervention abroad, whether it's in the Western Hemisphere, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's helping Israel, whether it's helping the Ukrainians. They simply believe that it is not the Americans' business to spend money helping others when they could be helping their own countrymen. That's basically the ideology, and that is what she's going after. And there are a few other Republicans who are pointing to that. Some Republicans are also pointing to the fact that maybe, especially those in Congress, are saying, well, maybe you should have come and asked us first, because it is, in the end, Congress's role to sort of give the authority to the president to go to war with another country. But I think what is going to be interesting domestically in the coming days and weeks is how this is going to play out with the MAGA world more broadly. Now that we've clearly seen that this is not just a one and done, we go in, we get Nicolás Maduro out, and then we're done. If you are going to say we are taking over Venezuela, we are going to run the country, how is that going to play out with those Americans who wanted Donald Trump and who believed Donald Trump when he said, we're not going to get involved in forever wars, we're not going to get involved abroad?
We'll also see this while we're on air. It's worth saying this, Kethevane. This is coming from AP, saying that the US won't govern Venezuela, but will press charges through oil blockades. This is from Marco Rubio a short while ago, after Trump's claims of running the country. So we see already things are starting to unwind a little bit as we start to unpick the press conference. Hélène, interesting, that maybe not surprising that the rhetoric is different to the reality, or at least it's changing. Marco Rubio now saying that the US won't govern Venezuela.
Yeah, I think it was never to be the case. I think this is not about restoring democracy. I'm convinced that Donald Trump and his administration are not concerned at all about this. They're just concerned about seizing the world's largest petrol resource. I think it's far greater even than what Saudi Arabia has. And I think, in his speech, Donald Trump has used the term petrol 20 times. So I think that was his objective. I also believe that while the military operation was impeccable, if you like, from the point of view of the result, I think there must have been a great level of collusion and preparation for it. But while, we have no doubt to believe the talents of the intelligence American services, I do believe that somehow some agreement was passed. Maybe that the military will rule the country, or the vice president will remain in place. And I think what the biggest concern for the Trump administration is for the American oil companies to take hold of the resources, and thus having the United States somehow weakening China, which I think gets 80% of its own oil from Venezuela, and also Russia, because we're going to see great, movements as to the price of oil. And if you remember, the war in Ukraine is funded mainly by the oil and gas exports by Russia, which today is under sanctions, but still happening. So what we have there is something which is much bigger. And of course, Donald Trump, by kind of saying, look, I haven't changed the government. It was just, we captured the president of that country. So therefore, we didn't have to go to Congress. We didn't declare war on Venezuela, and that's why we today have, the Venezuelan people being told, sorry, that they have to go about their own business, as usual. So I think, that's why we see this change as well, because, it's not about the United States ruling Venezuela. And indeed, if we go back to Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya, I mean, what did the Western operations, military operations, achieve in those countries, if not just chaos, and certainly not the restoration of democracy in none of these countries? So I think, if they were to do that with Venezuela, might end up with a civil war, and I think it will be a big mess for the Americans.
A big mess for the Americans. We are still getting information coming through, Hélène, not just from the Marco Rubio saying that we won't govern Venezuela. President Trump has given an interview with Atlantic magazine saying this: Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, if she doesn't do what's right, quote, she will pay a bigger price than Maduro. We're going to hear in a moment. I want to bring in Mikey Kay in London. He's a renowned military analyst. He's presenter of BBC's Security Brief programme as well, the Security Brief. Before that, I wanted to hear again from Gabriel Hetland, author of Democracy on the Ground, Local Politics in Latin America's Left Turn, because I want to talk about Cuba as well, Gabriel. If you look at the oil reserves coming via Venezuela, the quote is, according to AP, around 25 to 30% of Cuba's total oil, 30 to 40% are its own, but that's a lot of oil, and it's affected already. The fact that the shipments of oil taken by the Trump administration, the US actions in December, has seen even more widespread blackouts. We're talking about a vulnerable potential country here, aren't we? A vulnerable government, given that Trump is now saying, we effectively have control of the oil. How do you see this playing out?
It's a very important aspect of what's happening right now. Cuba and Venezuela have had an economic relationship where Venezuela has been shipping significant amounts of oil for, well over a decade to Cuba at very reduced rates. Cuba has often sold that oil on the open market for hard currency that they use for all sorts of projects and state uses within Cuba. And in exchange, they have sent doctors, they have sent a lot of military and security advisors to Venezuela. And it's hard to know all the specific details, of course, but it's hard to imagine that that relationship will continue in any fashion whatsoever at this point. It's hard to imagine that the Trump administration and Marco Rubio in particular would allow Venezuela to continue sending oil in any fashion, but particularly at deeply discounted rates to Cuba. So that means that Cuba could be looking at a major immediate reduction in oil, and there could be a total severing of the sort of military and security relationship between Cuba and Venezuela. It's important to note that this relationship has deteriorated in recent years. Venezuela has been sending less oil than it used to before, partly related to its own economic crisis within Venezuela. It's not clear if Cuba's military presence in Venezuela has been reduced compared to what it was some years ago, but nonetheless, the capture of Maduro, the change in government within Venezuela, is almost sure to have a major and drastic impact on the Cuba-Venezuela relationship, and we'll have to wait and see to know exactly how that plays out. But I think it's going to be very significant.
It is very significant. The other point in this triage of information coming through, it's very hard to actually just take a breath and actually work out the operation itself, how utterly extraordinary it was, the speed it was, 2 hours, 20 minutes. We want to hear Mikey Kay's perspective on this. We all want to hear this. Mikey served in the British Armed Forces for 20 years, flew assault helicopters. Before we go to Mikey, I just want a quick word with Fraser, because you're looking at the information coming in, Marco Rubio's comments saying that we don't want to govern Venezuela. This is in the last few minutes itself. What's your take, Fraser, as to how things are starting to play out in rhetoric?
I mean, the White House is the chief of rhetoric, and this White House is very good at changing headlines and keeping people talking, and also diverting people across multiple different topics as well. I think it's no surprise that the actual reality of what this is going to look like is very different to what the White House is saying, very different to what Donald Trump said in that press conference immediately after the seizing of Maduro. And in reality, it is probably going to fall to the US to try to influence the regime that is left behind. But of course, they are keeping up their threats of US boots on the ground, military troops there as leverage in the Caribbean as well. But I think if we go back quickly to that Atlantic interview that Donald Trump gave this morning to my colleague Michael Shearer, it's interesting as well that the other place he touches on is Greenland. Once again, Greenland is now back in the headlines. This as well after the wife of Stephen Miller, who is Donald Trump's deputy chief of staff for policy. She tweeted a picture yesterday of Greenland covered in an American flag. She tweeted that, prompting responses from Denmark's, which of course is a Greenland is territory of Denmark, and the Danish ambassador posted about that and saying that it was a sovereign territory. But once again, Donald Trump is not letting up on this. And in this interview with the Atlantic, he was asked whether the operation in Venezuela there should be any lessons learned for the people of Greenland, and he said it was up to other people to come to those conclusions. But Donald Trump said we do need Greenland, absolutely, we need it for defense. He said that it was surrounded by Chinese and Russian ships. So once again, Donald Trump moving on and keeping people talking about different topics to try to, take the spotlight away from something that he might not necessarily want to talk about right now as well. So this White House continuing to keep people guessing and continuing to shift multiple topics and multiple stories at the same time to keep everybody on their toes.
Very interesting. Let's go to London, because the shock and awe of this 2 hour, 20-minute operation. Let's get the view from Mikey Kay, renowned military analyst, presenter of the BBC's Security Brief programme, served, as I mentioned, in the British Armed Forces for 20 years before going into filmmaking, and flew assault helicopters on numerous operational tours. Joins us tonight. Great to have you on the programme with us, Mikey. You recorded a programme a month ago. You predicted this would happen. Tell us about why you could see it coming and how it actually played out.
I mean, that's a very kind intro. When you have the knowledge and expertise and experience of flying those type of Night Stalker operations, which I did for numerous years over Baghdad, working with UK Special Forces, you get a real understanding of, attempted regime change in Iraq, attempted regime change in Afghanistan, and you kind of know, whilst technology is evolving, and we'll come on to the technology piece in a moment, because the operation was incredibly sophisticated. I don't think we've ever seen anything quite like it. You understand that there are some basic tenets of the way that warfare plays out. And if you imagine that the mission, going all the way back to 6 months, 8 months, if the mission was to capture Maduro in his home territory, then you've got to work backwards off that. What do I mean by that? So you've got to work all the way through to the very first thing that the US has to do, which is they have to start getting human intelligence, on the behavioral activity of Maduro. There are 3 types of intelligence. There's human intelligence, which is usually from an asset or an informant. There's imagery intelligence, which can do what's called pattern of life, so understand behavioral patterns. That usually comes from Reaper drones or some form of overwatch that can have long endurance and just sit up there without being detected and suck up all that imagery intelligence. And that's through electro-optic cameras, it's through thermal cameras. And then you've got ELINT or SIGINT, signals intelligence. And the signals intelligence piece is also critical when you're building up for one of these missions. And that's basically listening into telephone conversations, triangulating whereabouts. And what the US have done is, according to open source reporting, the CIA plant was in there during the summer of last year. It's building up that picture of behavioral patterns by Maduro, because the last thing that you want to do is you want to launch, you don't want to launch a huge mission like that and then not have the asset or the target in the place that you think that person's going to be. So it goes back a long way. It starts with the intelligence. The end state is putting up helicopter or aviation assets. In this case, it was the MH-60 Blackhawks and the MH-47 Chinooks, with overwatch of drone overhead. And then the bit in the middle is what's called suppression of enemy air defense. So the suppression of enemy air defense bit is American jets. And as you rightly pointed out, about a month ago, we saw a massive buildup of US capability inside the Caribbean from the USS Gerald Ford, which is the largest aircraft carrier, largest warship in the world, displaces 100,000 tons. The ability to launch over 200 sorties from that aircraft carrier. You've then got a buildup of F-35Bs, which are the 5th generation jet inside Puerto Rico. You've got Reapers and drones going into Puerto Rico. You've got MV Ospreys, which are troop carriers going into Puerto Rico. And then the really interesting bit is you've got the special forces, the US Special Forces build up off the coast of Venezuela. And that involves what's called the, it's a ship that the US have that is specially designed to be able to launch helicopter missions. And then you've got these helicopters, the Blackhawks and the CH-47s, which are specifically geared to have a additional special forces capability. So terrain following radar, refueling probes, etc. So it's been a huge build up in the making, and we can go a little bit more into the advanced stuff on suppression of enemy air defense if you want.
Let's do it, because you take us beyond the layman understanding here. Military operations, your insight is valuable given your experience as well. 2 things interest me in particular. One, you talk about the technology. I believe F-35. There was a technology that other countries just couldn't use in that 2 hours, 20 minutes, in be able to direct its assault on particular military installations, communication infrastructure, and also your experience, this is your world, the heli assault itself, the special force operations in coming off the aircraft and getting to Maduro.
Yeah, so let's start with SEAD, suppression of enemy air defense. That basically is using military capability to be able to suppress any form of response from Venezuela. And in this case, the big threat was to the jets was the S-300 missiles, ballistic counter-air defense, which Venezuela purchased from Russia. Now, the problem with those is that they are mobile, but the problem with those is they've got a huge radar, a very powerful radar on them. So as soon as those systems turn their radar on, that flashes up like a firework inside the back of a F-18 jet that has got a anti-radiation missile strapped to the side. And an anti-radiation missile basically is a missile that will lock straight on to that radar signature from an S-300, and it will go in and it will take that S-300 out. Now, the Venezuelans knew this. So the Venezuelans were then starting to move the S-300s because the topography is quite interesting in Venezuela. It's quite hilly, and if it's quite hilly, it means that you can get a little bit more protection from any air threat. So that's what started happening. Now, the interesting bit about the F-35 is we know, the British use the F-35, the Norwegians have got it, the IDF have been using it in strikes against Doha and Iran. Historically, or most people think the F-35 is used for a kinetic platform. Kinetic means dropping a bomb. Which it is, and it has been. But in this particular case, it's also the most sophisticated fighter in the world in terms of the sensors that it has. So at 20 nautical miles off the coast, you've got a US F-35 acting as a sensor. And what it's doing is it's tracking the movements of those S-300s in real time. And then what it's doing is it's passing those real-time updates of GPS locations of the S-300s to the Tomahawk land attack missiles, which are coming out of either submarines or US warships based in the Caribbean. So basically, there's nowhere to go. And I can't think back to any operation, and I've served 3 tours in Iraq, I've done 2 tours Afghanistan, I've done Kosovo, evacuation operations out of West Africa. I can't think of any other operation where there was this level of sophistication to be able to target air defenses that are actually trying to maneuver out the way of the threat. So it was very complex, and it was also incredibly accurate and incredibly effective.
Before we go into the compound and the Helioscope itself, I want to go back to Gabriel a second. Stay with us, Mikey. Gabriel Hetland, who's got many commitments tonight, so thank you for your time. But I do want to just get a word with you related to this, listening to the operation itself and what Mikey was saying, Gabriel, which is, you've studied and you know Latin American politics, particularly Venezuelan politics, very well. When you look at the military infrastructure and you look at the fact that it's happened so quickly, there's a lot of talk now about the aftermath and about the concern for the vulnerability of those political prisoners and whether the authoritarian government would take action. What's your take on that, Gabriel?
It doesn't seem like democracy or human rights is a major consideration of the Trump administration. None of their actions so far have suggested that they are, allowing the continuation of the Maduro regime without Maduro. So it's Madurismo without Maduro, which has, critics of Maduro upset about that, including critics on the left, not just the right-wing opposition within Venezuela. And so, some of the other moves that are happening right now also suggest that we're not looking at any sort of electoral process starting anytime soon. I think all of the things that Delcy Rodriguez has done, particularly stepping up as an interim president, they have declared Maduro to be temporarily rather than permanently absent within Venezuela. And that's a move that means it doesn't trigger the constitutional requirement to call for new elections within 30 days. Instead, it allows them to rule indefinitely. So as long as that goes on, you could have the continuation of the same regime, which has a lot of, critiques around human rights, around civil rights, around, political freedoms as well within Venezuela. And again, there's no indication that the Trump administration has any real interest in that. It seems like Trump's, own primary interest in all of this is to have the trophy of Maduro and then also have Venezuelan oil. The question of democracy, the question of a transition doesn't seem to be on his radar, doesn't seem to be important. I don't remember, if the word democracy was mentioned at all in Trump's press conference yesterday, but it certainly wasn't the major theme of the press conference. And I think that's quite notable.
Really good to have you on with us tonight, Gabriel. Thank you for your time. Gabriel Hetland, sociologist specialising in Latin American politics and author too of Democracy on the Ground, Local Politics in Latin America's Left Turn. Still with us, Fraser Jackson, our US correspondent in Washington, D.C. Kethevane Gorjestani, our international affairs editor as well with us. Plus, French Socialist Senator Hélène Conway-Mouret, and Mikey Kay as well, the presenter of the BBC Security Brief programme. Hélène, before we leave you as well, I know you've got commitments tonight. Let me ask you about President Macron's statement, saying in the past, well, since overnight, saying that the 2024 presidential candidate, Edmundo González, should lead a peaceful transition, that the people got rid of a dictatorship. No question on legal issues for the US. Has he gone far enough?
Well, it's a very strange and disappointing statement by the French president. One expects better as regards the defense of international law and violation of the UN Charter, which has taken place with the American operation. So does it go far enough? Well, I think it doesn't go anywhere. That's the problem. And which again goes back to what I said previously about, unfortunately, Europe displaying its weaknesses and also being so much centered on the resolution of the war in Ukraine, which obviously is very much linked with the American commitment to continue supporting Ukraine, that I think the Europeans are totally entangled in that, and out of fear, out of weakness, whatever, is not, well, like, we're not playing the role we should be playing in this. I mean, what has taken place there in Venezuela may take place in Cuba. Of course, it's going to please a lot of Republicans, I mean, if indeed Cuba and Venezuela fall, I mean, these have been thorns really for a long time in American history, to have these countries, standing up to the American domination. So, of course, that will be pleasing to some, but I think overall what has taken place is not good news for anybody, for international security, international law, institutions, and so on. So.
Hélène, lovely to talk to you tonight. Thank you for your time. Hélène Conway-Mouret, thank you, French Socialist Senator. Let's go back to Mikey. Very interesting to listen to your insight. A question that Fraser and Kethevane, we've been talking amongst ourselves politically about whether there was possible CIA involvement. Could this take place without somebody key to having turned on Maduro? And when it comes to that, operation itself, the heli assault that we were talking about, going into that fortress-like building, that which we know from war games that the Pentagon and Special Forces had role-played this before. Mikey, is your assessment that this could have taken place without somebody on the ground who turned?
No. The level of information that you need from an informant perspective on the behavioral habits of Maduro just wouldn't have been there. So the CIA plant, I think the open reporting on that, I think it's highly likely that that did occur. I think the question is not whether there was someone on the inside that was being an informant, it's to what extent that number of people exactly exists. So it was a CIA plant, but also who else was that plant, that asset, talking to gather that information over 6 to 8 months? I think that's the interesting question, as to what extent people were involved in this when we're talking about an inside job.
When you look at the ability of the US forces now, and you look at the scale of that operation, Mikey, is the technology and their ability just surpassing anything? If it happened anywhere, what chance? The question is, what chance has most country got? The might of the US, if they want to pick somebody out, is your summary that they could just do it wherever they are?
I mean, there are so many factors that go into that. I mean, having a CVN or an aircraft carrier, CSG, carrier support group, that allows power projection, it allows force projection. So it just all depends on, the level of capability of whomever the US might decide to go after next. I mean, there are some bits that change with technology and there are some bits that don't. Let me give you some examples. So in order to launch that Special Forces mission on a 2-hour 20 journey, there are four major risks as an aviation commander, which I used to be, and a pilot in doing a type of operation like that. The obvious one that people think about is, what is the threat from the ground? Now, I spoke earlier on about the suppression of any air defense, Tomahawk land attack missiles, taking out S-300s. The S-300 isn't a threat to a low-level flying helicopter. It's what's called MANPADS, man-portable air defense, a really mobile tube that fits on the shoulder of a soldier and can be launched using a infrared or heat-seeking head, which then targets the engines or the heat source of whatever the target is. So it would be engines in the case of helicopters. Now, the Venezuelans bought SA-24 Igla, that's the NATO code name, for these missiles. And thankfully, when I was operating in Baghdad, there was no known evidence or intelligence that Al-Qaeda had these kind of MANPADS, which provides you with great relief. These SA-24 Iglas also will have a countermeasures capability. So what that means is that when we used to fly, the American soft forces, special operations forces, will have the same self-defense equipment on the helicopters. But the primary one that helps evade a MANPAD launched missile is flares. And basically flares will come out of the helicopter pointing forward. And hopefully the idea of the flare is to go into the scope of the IR seeker head, and the IR seeker head then decides to take the flare and not stay on the engine, i.e. decoying the missile away. So that's an important one. And I have seen unverified footage of MANPADs being launched at these helicopters. So that's threat number one. If you want to jump in, please do.
Only because we don't want to crash the program. But you know what? It is fascinating to get an insight. It's not every day we can go into your world, to that world, to understand the operation. Mikey, we will speak again, no doubt, in the coming days. Really appreciate your time. Renowned military analyst Mikey Kay, presenter of the BBC Security Brief programme. We'll speak soon. Thank you for your time. Thank you also, Fraser Jackson, our US correspondent in DC. Kethevane Gorjestani, thank you too, our International Affairs editor. We'll be back with you both very shortly. Stay with us here on France 24. We'll be back in just a moment.